The day everything fell apart didn't announce itself. There was no warning, no raised voices, no moment that felt final. It happened quietly, inside a room where decisions were made faster than understanding, and where my voice carried less weight than assumptions already formed. By the time I realized what was happening, the outcome had already been decided. My name sounded different that day. It was spoken carefully, as if it belonged to someone fragile, unreliable, or incomplete. Accusations were framed as concern. Doubt was disguised as protection. And every attempt I made to explain myself was treated like an interruption instead of an answer. I didn't just lose custody, opportunity, or reputation. I lost credibility. And once credibility is taken, everything else follows. Paperwork was slid across the table with practiced calm. The language was neutral, professional, and final. No one looked angry. No one looked cruel. That made it worse. It meant they believed this was reasonable. Necessary. I remember standing up afterward, holding documents that felt heavier than paper should ever feel. Outside the room, the world continued as if nothing had changed. People walked past me, unaware that my life had been quietly rearranged without my consent. The hardest part wasn't the loss itself. It was the certainty surrounding it. No hesitation. No acknowledgement that they might be wrong. Someone else's story had arrived first, and it had been accepted without resistance. I replayed the moments leading up to that day over and over, searching for the exact point where everything shifted. A sentence. A misunderstanding. A silence I should have broken. But the truth was simpler and more painful. This wasn't about what I said or didn't say. It was about who they chose to believe. And as I walked away, I understood something that would change me forever. Justice doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes, it disappears quietly the moment you become inconvenient. I didn't know then how long the consequences would last, or how deeply the judgment would follow me into every future interaction. I only knew that something essential had been taken, and that recovering it would require more than anger. It would require patience, clarity, and a willingness to endure being misunderstood longer than felt fair. That realization settled in slowly, marking the true beginning of a fight I could not afford to lose, even if no one noticed it happening. Once the decision was made, the story hardened almost immediately. People stopped asking questions and started repeating conclusions as if they were facts already proven. Silence replaced curiosity, and distance replaced conversation. I felt it in the way people looked past me instead of at me. Friends who once checked in daily suddenly became busy. Messages went unanswered. Plans quietly disappeared. No one confronted me directly, but everyone adjusted their behavior as if the truth had already been settled. That was when I understood the real damage wasn't just the ruling. It was the narrative that followed it. The version of events people accepted was neat and comforting. It explained everything without requiring effort or doubt. It allowed them to believe the system had worked as intended. And once that belief took hold, my explanations became unnecessary, even inconvenient. I tried to clarify at first. I chose my words carefully, hoping logic would cut through assumption. But every explanation sounded defensive. Every detail I offered was treated as justification instead of context. The more I spoke, the more I seemed guilty of wanting to be understood. Eventually, I stopped explaining. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I realized the story no longer needed my voice. It had momentum. It had authority. And it didn't care whether it was accurate. What shocked me most was how reasonable it all sounded. The accusations weren't dramatic. They were framed as concern, responsibility, protection. That framing gave people permission to step back without guilt. They could tell themselves they were being cautious, not cruel. Meanwhile, I watched my identity slowly detach from who I actually was. I became a warning, a label, a simplified lesson others could reference without knowing the details. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I stopped trying to fix the story emotionally. I started observing it instead. Because narratives built on distortion always leave gaps. They rely on consistency they can't maintain forever. And I knew, even then, that somewhere inside the certainty surrounding my fall, there were cracks waiting to be noticed by someone. Isolation didn't arrive as a single moment. It unfolded slowly, through absence rather than action. Calls that stopped coming. Names that vanished from my notifications. People who once shared space with me now choosing distance instead of discomfort. I didn't blame them, at least not at first. Standing beside someone under suspicion carries risk. Silence feels safer than loyalty when truth feels complicated. And complicated had become the word that followed my name everywhere. The loneliness wasn't just personal. It was institutional. Every interaction became formal, stripped of warmth and context. I wasn't a person with a history anymore. I was a situation. The case. A problem to be managed efficiently. Compassion existed, but only within boundaries. Empathy was offered cautiously, as if it might imply agreement. I felt myself becoming smaller in those spaces. More careful with words. More hesitant with eye contact. Every sentence felt like it needed approval before being spoken. Every pause felt like it might be misinterpreted. So I learned restraint. I stopped volunteering information. Stopped filling silences. Stopped explaining emotions no one had asked about. I conserved energy the way people do when they don't know how long the storm will last. At night, the quiet was heavier. There were no distractions left to soften the reality. I replayed events repeatedly, not to relive pain, but to understand structure. What had been said? What had been assumed? What had never been verified? That's when I began noticing things. Small inconsistencies. Timelines that didn't align perfectly. Statements that felt rehearsed rather than remembered. Details that carried confidence without support. At first, I dismissed them as hope disguised as logic. But the patterns repeated. And slowly, isolation began to change its shape. It stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like distance from noise. Without constant opinions shaping my thoughts, clarity emerged. I could see the situation without urgency, without the pressure to prove myself in every interaction. I realized something then that surprised me. Silence wasn't erasing me. It was protecting me. While others assumed my quiet meant acceptance, I was listening more closely than ever. I was learning how narratives were maintained, where they were fragile, and how easily confidence replaced verification. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was no longer lost. Isolation had stripped everything down to essentials. And in that stripped-down space, I understood the most important truth of all. If I was going to reclaim what I had lost, it wouldn't happen through confrontation. It would happen through precision, timing, and patience. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt something close to control returning. The decision didn't arrive with confidence or certainty. It arrived with exhaustion. One ordinary morning, I realized I was tired of arguing with shadows and explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. Nothing I said was changing outcomes. Nothing I felt was being considered. I was spending energy trying to reopen doors that had already been locked. That's when I stopped reacting. Not because I had accepted what happened, but because I understood that emotional resistance was feeding the very system that dismissed me. Every explanation gave the narrative more material. Every outburst confirmed assumptions about instability. Silence, on the other hand, created discomfort. So I chose silence deliberately. I stopped correcting people. Stopped defending my character. Stopped chasing validation from institutions that had already moved on. Instead, I redirected my attention inward and downward, into details others ignored. I began documenting everything. Dates, emails, wording, pauses, inconsistencies. I treated each interaction like evidence instead of conversation. Emotion was still there, but it no longer controlled my actions. I learned to separate how something felt from how it could be proven. This shift changed my posture entirely. People assumed my calm meant defeat. They mistook restraint for surrender. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. I wasn't waiting for sympathy anymore. I was preparing for precision. I studied procedures. I learned timelines. I noticed where rules were bent casually and where assumptions replaced verification. The system that failed me relied on order, documentation, and consistency. So I decided to meet it on its own terms. I didn't announce this change. I didn't warn anyone. I simply became harder to read and more intentional with every move. While others believed the story was finished, I understood it was only paused. Justice, I realized, doesn't reward desperation. It rewards preparation and timing. And in choosing patience over protest, I finally reclaimed something that had been taken early on. Control. Not control over outcomes, but control over myself, my response, and the pace at which the truth would eventually surface. From that moment forward, I stopped asking when things would be made right. I started deciding how ready I would be when the opportunity finally appeared. That decision didn't make the loss hurt less. But it gave the pain direction, and for the first time since everything collapsed, direction felt like hope disguised as discipline. I wasn't done. I was just getting deliberate. And that made all the difference going forward. Even unseen, my preparation had already begun reshaping the ending ahead for me.
I didn't start looking for proof right away. At first, I was just trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. I went back over conversations, not emotionally, but structurally, asking what had actually been said versus what had been assumed. That's when patterns began to surface. Certain phrases appeared again and again in official records, almost identical in tone and wording. Different people, same language. It didn't feel organic. It felt transferred, repeated, rehearsed. Someone had shaped the story early, and others had adopted it without questioning its origin. Timelines didn't fully align either. Events were described as happening closer together than they actually were. Delays disappeared. Context was compressed until nuance no longer fit. The story worked only if no one slowed it down. I slowed it down. I laid everything out chronologically. Emails, messages, dates, decisions. When placed side by side, the certainty I had faced earlier began to look fragile. Not false enough to collapse immediately, but thin enough to bend under scrutiny. What struck me most was what was missing. There were no direct confirmations. No independent verification. Key claims relied on interpretation rather than evidence. They had been accepted because they sounded plausible, not because they were proven. I understood then why emotion had worked against me in the beginning. Emotional responses invite judgment. Structure invites examination. So I kept building quietly. Every inconsistency was logged, not shared. Every gap was noted, not exploited. I wasn't trying to expose anyone yet. Exposure too early would trigger defense. Defense would harden positions. Instead, I let confidence remain undisturbed. People spoke freely when they believed the outcome was final. They repeated assumptions casually. They filled in gaps with certainty instead of caution. Each casual statement added weight to the contradictions I was collecting. What had once felt like overwhelming loss began to feel measurable, defined, contained within systems that relied on accuracy to function. For the first time, I saw the situation not as a verdict, but as a structure with stress points. And structures, no matter how imposing, fail when pressure is applied in the right places at the right time. I wasn't ready to apply pressure yet, but I knew exactly where it would land when I did. That realization steadied me. I no longer felt chased by the past or desperate for immediate correction. I was mapping terrain. Every system leaves footprints, and those footprints always lead somewhere. My role had changed from accused to analyst, from reactive to deliberate. The longer I observed, the clearer the path forward became, and clarity replaced fear with something far more useful: quiet confidence. It was returning faster than expected. I wasn't looking for the turning point when it happened. It surfaced quietly, hidden inside something ordinary I had almost ignored. A message thread I had skimmed before suddenly felt wrong when read without emotion attached. One sentence didn't match the timeline. At first, I assumed I was overanalyzing. Trauma has a way of bending perception. But when I checked the date again, the inconsistency remained. The claim depended on an event that hadn't happened yet. That was the first solid fracture. I went back through everything with fresh eyes, removing intention and focusing only on sequence. Dates either aligned or they didn't. Actions either occurred or they couldn't have. There was no room for interpretation once time entered the equation. More fractures appeared. Statements contradicted earlier records. Descriptions shifted subtly depending on audience. What had been presented as fact was, in reality, flexible. The confidence surrounding it had masked that flexibility from scrutiny. Then came the moment that confirmed it wasn't coincidence. A document referenced approval that had never been granted. I verified it twice. 3 times. The signature existed, but the authorization process did not. It was assumed, not completed. That assumption had carried enormous consequences. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not because I felt vindicated, but because I understood the responsibility it created. Proof changes posture. It shifts power, and power attracts attention. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't confront the person responsible. Instead, I secured it. I made copies. I stored originals. I documented the context in which it appeared. Evidence without framing can be dismissed. Evidence with structure becomes difficult to ignore. This wasn't justice yet. It was potential, and potential requires discipline. I reminded myself why patience mattered. Revealing this too early would invite explanation, revision, and damage control. I needed the system to encounter the truth on its own terms without warning. For the first time since everything collapsed, I wasn't imagining a path forward. I was holding it. I understood then that recovery would not be loud. It would be procedural, slow, and undeniable. The same system that failed me would be required to correct itself. All I had to do was remain precise, resist urgency, and allow truth to mature fully before placing it where denial could no longer survive. That knowledge steadied my breathing and confirmed I was no longer powerless at last.
Once the evidence existed, the hardest part began. Waiting. Every instinct urged me to act immediately, to expose the inconsistency, to confront the people who had dismissed me, to demand correction now that I finally had proof in my hands. The temptation was constant, fueled by months of silence and restraint. But urgency was the enemy. I reminded myself that timing mattered more than truth alone. Evidence revealed too early invites manipulation. It gives others the chance to reframe, reinterpret, or quietly close ranks. I needed the system unprepared. So I waited. That waiting wasn't passive. It required control. Every interaction became a test of restraint. I listened more than I spoke. I allowed assumptions to remain unchallenged. I let confidence continue uninterrupted. People are most revealing when they believe there's nothing left to hide. I watched as conversations grew careless. Statements became bolder. Certainty increased. The story hardened further, and in doing so, trapped itself. Each repetition added weight to the contradiction already documented. The emotional cost of waiting was real. There were days when silence felt unbearable, when the injustice pressed against my patience and demanded release. But I resisted. This wasn't about relief. It was about resolution. I used the time to prepare. I organized the evidence cleanly, not as accusation, but as sequence. I practiced explaining it without emotion, without emphasis, without commentary. Facts presented neutrally are harder to dismiss. I also studied precedent. Similar cases. Similar failures. How systems corrected themselves when faced with undeniable contradictions. I learned where authority shifted once documentation entered the conversation. The waiting changed me. It taught me that restraint isn't weakness. It's leverage disguised as calm. While others believed I had accepted defeat, I was becoming more composed than I had ever been. There was a strange comfort in being underestimated. No one monitored my movements. No one anticipated a challenge. The story had been sealed, and that false certainty created the space I needed. Eventually, something shifted externally. A routine review. The procedural check. Nothing dramatic. Just an opening the system created for itself. And I knew then that the wait had not been wasted. I was ready. Not emotionally, but structurally. Not for confrontation, but for presentation. The truth no longer belonged to me alone. It belonged to the process that would be forced to acknowledge it. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't be dramatic. It would be irreversible. Waiting had transformed pain into precision. And precision, I had learned, was the quiet force that systems could not ignore once activated. The opening didn't arrive the way I imagined it would. There was no call, no warning, no sudden shift in tone. It came disguised as routine, a procedural review scheduled automatically, triggered by timing rather than intention. That's how systems expose themselves. They rely on orders so deeply that they create their own checkpoints. When I received the notice, my first reaction wasn't relief. It was focus. This wasn't the moment to speak yet. It was the moment to prepare how the truth would enter the room. Leverage isn't just evidence. It's placement. I reviewed everything again, not to confirm I was right, but to ensure there were no loose ends. Each document followed the next logically. Dates led cleanly into outcomes. There was no commentary, no emotion, no accusation. Just sequence. I framed the evidence the way the system understands best, as a procedural inconsistency, not a moral failure. Systems resist blame, but they cannot ignore error. That distinction mattered. What gave the leverage real weight wasn't the contradiction itself. It was the fact that the contradiction affected the system's credibility. If ignored, it exposed negligence. If acknowledged, it demanded correction. I didn't present myself as wronged. I presented the process as incomplete. That shifted the balance immediately. Questions replaced assumptions. Tone softened. The room didn't grow defensive, it grew attentive. People leaned forward, not to argue, but to understand what they might have missed. That's when I knew the leverage had landed. No one looked at me with suspicion anymore. They looked at the paperwork, at the timeline, at the approvals that hadn't actually happened. The truth moved away from me and into the system's hands, where it belonged. The person whose story had driven everything wasn't present. They didn't need to be. Their certainty had already been documented, and now it stood unsupported. I stayed calm. I answered only what was asked. I resisted the urge to explain beyond necessity. Silence once again worked in my favor. By the end of the review, nothing had been resolved yet, but everything had changed. The narrative was no longer intact. What had once been treated as settled was now labeled under examination. That phrase alone shifted power. It created pause. It invited scrutiny. For the first time since everything had been taken from me, I wasn't reacting to the system. The system was reacting to the truth. I walked out knowing justice hadn't arrived yet, but it was no longer avoidable. The leverage was active now, and once activated, it doesn't disappear. It moves forward quietly, steadily, until the outcome adjusts to match the facts. And I was finally on the side of inevitability. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with tone. Messages that once felt distant became measured. Requests for information arrived framed as clarification rather than dismissal. I wasn't being summoned anymore. I was being consulted. That distinction mattered. For months, decisions had happened around me. Now they required my input, not because of sympathy, but because the process demanded accuracy again. I didn't rush to reclaim space. I entered it carefully. Each response I gave was deliberate, limited to what was necessary. I resisted the urge to revisit the past emotionally. The moment I tied my return to resentment, I would lose the ground I had gained. Instead, I stayed procedural. The system began correcting itself in small ways first. Language softened. Assumptions were replaced with questions. Files were reopened quietly, without announcement. What had once been closed was now considered incomplete. I noticed how quickly certainty evaporated once scrutiny returned. People who had spoken confidently before now chose their words carefully. Statements were revised. Timelines adjusted. The story was no longer repeated, it was examined. I didn't celebrate the shift. Celebration implies victory, and victory invites resistance. This wasn't about winning. It was about restoring accuracy. The person whose actions had set everything in motion wasn't mentioned openly, but their absence grew louder. Their version of events no longer stood alone. It was now one interpretation among others. And interpretations require evidence. I felt something unfamiliar during that period, not relief, but steadiness. The weight I had been carrying for months began to redistribute. I wasn't lighter yet, but I was no longer off balance. What surprised me most was how quickly people adjusted once the narrative lost authority. No apologies arrived. No confessions followed. The system simply pivoted, as if the earlier certainty had never existed. That, I realized, was how institutional justice often works. It doesn't admit fault. It corrects quietly. By the end of that phase, I wasn't restored yet. Nothing official had been returned. But the direction had changed. And direction matters more than speed. For the first time since the fall, I wasn't waiting in the dark. I was walking back into the process that had once pushed me out, carrying nothing but facts, patience, and the calm that comes from knowing the truth no longer needed my defense. It was moving on its own now. Not everyone accepted the shift quietly. As the process reopened and questions replaced certainty, resistance surfaced where I expected it most. It didn't arrive as confrontation. It arrived as hesitation, delay, and subtle attempts to redirect attention. The narrative tried to defend itself. Suddenly, context mattered again, but only selectively. Explanations appeared for inconsistencies that had once been ignored. Words like misunderstanding and oversight entered conversations carefully, as if chosen to soften impact without accepting responsibility. I recognized the pattern immediately. This was damage control. When certainty collapses, the next move is preservation. Not of truth, but of position. The goal wasn't to re-establish facts. It was to minimize exposure. I stayed still. Every instinct urged me to respond, to counter explanations with corrections, to push harder now that momentum had shifted. But pressure too early can reset defenses. I let resistance reveal itself fully. Emails became longer, more detailed, less confident. Requests for clarification increased, followed by revised statements that subtly contradicted earlier ones. Each revision left a trail. The person responsible for shaping the original story attempted to re-enter the process indirectly. Their language changed. Certainty faded into suggestion. What had once been framed as fact was now presented as perspective. That shift mattered. Facts don't need revision. Perspectives do. I documented everything again, quietly reinforcing the structure I had built. Resistance, when observed carefully, exposes exactly what is being protected. What surprised me was how fragile authority becomes when it senses scrutiny. Confidence evaporated quickly. Meetings were postponed. Decisions delayed. The system slowed itself down in an effort to avoid correction. But slowing only increased visibility. The more resistance appeared, the clearer the fault lines became. What had been hidden behind momentum was now exposed by hesitation. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand outcomes. I allowed the process to continue unfolding under its own weight. Because at this stage, justice didn't need force. It needed patience. And patience had already outlasted certainty once before. By the time resistance began to fade, replaced by compliance and caution, the outcome was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of when. The system could delay correction, but it could not reverse what had already been documented. And I understood then that resistance wasn't a setback. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the truth had reached a place where it could no longer be ignored, only managed. And management, eventually, leads to admission, even when no one ever says the words out loud. The reveal didn't come with a dramatic announcement. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment of public reckoning. It arrived in the most understated way possible, through documentation. A meeting was scheduled. Routine in appearance, deliberate in purpose. I entered without expectation, carrying nothing more than what had already been shared. The evidence no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the process. The questions were direct this time. Not emotional. Not speculative. Procedural. Each inconsistency was addressed one by one. Not as accusation, but as verification. Dates were cross-checked. Approvals confirmed. Assumptions traced back to their source. The structure I had built held. Explanations were offered, but they no longer fit cleanly. The story required too many adjustments to remain credible. Confidence dissolved into qualification. Certainty retreated into silence. I didn't need to speak much. That was the most unexpected part. For so long, I believed reclaiming what I lost would require persuasion. That I would have to argue, explain, and justify myself endlessly. Instead, the truth did the work without me. The system listened to itself. Each question narrowed the space where denial could exist. The contradictions weren't dramatic, but they were undeniable. They didn't accuse anyone of intent. They simply revealed that the outcome had been built on incomplete information. That distinction mattered. It allowed correction without humiliation. It gave the system a path to fix what it had mishandled without needing to confess wrongdoing publicly. When the meeting ended, nothing was announced. No decision was delivered. But the posture in the room had shifted completely. I wasn't seen as an exception anymore. I was seen as accurate. As I left, I felt no surge of victory. No sense of triumph. What I felt instead was calm. The kind that comes when effort finally gives way to inevitability. The reveal hadn't been about exposing someone else. It had been about restoring clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't fade quietly. It changes outcomes. Even when no one acknowledges it directly. Even when justice chooses silence over spectacle. The truth had finally taken its place. And it wasn't leaving. The shift became visible in small, unmistakable ways. Language changed first. Words that once implied doubt were replaced with terms that suggested review and reconsideration. The system didn't announce a mistake, but it no longer defended the outcome with certainty. Files were updated quietly. Statuses changed. Processes reopened without explanation. What had once been closed was now under evaluation. I noticed how quickly authority adjusts when accuracy becomes a priority again. People who had avoided eye contact before now spoke directly. Questions were framed respectfully. I was no longer handled cautiously, but carefully. That distinction carried weight. There was no apology offered, and I didn't expect one. Systems rarely apologize. They correct. Decisions that had been justified as final were now described as provisional. Language softened not out of empathy, but out of necessity. The truth had created boundaries the narrative could no longer cross. The person whose account had driven everything was asked to clarify details they had once stated confidently. Their responses lacked the certainty that had defined them earlier. Context replaced conviction. Memory replaced fact. And memory is fragile. I watched this shift without satisfaction or resentment. Those emotions would have distracted me from what mattered. This wasn't about being right. It was about being accurate. The process continued moving, slowly but deliberately, in a direction that no longer excluded me. Recommendations were revised. Authority passed quietly from assumption back to verification. What surprised me most was how ordinary the correction felt. No tension. No spectacle. Just adjustment. That was when I understood something important. Justice doesn't always arrive as vindication. Sometimes it arrives as normalization. You stop being treated as an exception. You're allowed back into the process without explanation. By the end of that phase, I wasn't restored yet. Nothing official had been returned. But the outcome was no longer predetermined. The system had repositioned itself around the truth, even if it never acknowledged how far it had drifted before. And in that repositioning, I found something I hadn't expected. Not because the damage was undone, but because the future was no longer locked behind someone else's certainty. The path forward existed again. And this time, it was grounded in fact, not assumption. That difference made all the waiting worthwhile. The restoration didn't arrive with ceremony. There was no formal announcement, no gathering, no moment where someone acknowledged how wrong they had been. It came through a notification, written in neutral language, confirming that what had been taken was being returned. Custody adjusted. Records amended. Restrictions lifted. Each correction was precise and unemotional, as if the system were carefully undoing its own handwriting. I read the notice more than once, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel its weight. After months of uncertainty, clarity felt unfamiliar. Relief arrived slowly, cautious and measured, as if it didn't trust permanence yet. Nothing was exactly as it had been before. Time had passed. Damage had settled. Relationships had shifted. Restoration corrected the outcome, but it couldn't restore the months of absence or the quiet losses that never appear in official records. Still, it mattered. What had once defined me in the eyes of others was no longer valid. The narrative that followed me into rooms had dissolved. People adjusted without comment, as if the earlier certainty had never existed. No one apologized. No one explained. The system simply moved forward. I noticed how quickly access returned once authority changed. Doors opened. Conversations resumed. My presence no longer required justification. That absence of resistance felt more validating than any apology could have. I didn't celebrate publicly. Celebration would have required revisiting the past, and I wasn't interested in reliving it. The correction was enough. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. I had imagined restoration as emotional release, as vindication, as triumph. Instead, it felt like balance returning. The weight I had been carrying finally redistributed evenly. Justice hadn't shouted my innocence. It had corrected its mistake. That correction was quiet, procedural, and incomplete, but it was real. As I stepped back into the role I had been denied, I understood something clearly. The system hadn't given me a second chance. I had given myself one by refusing to disappear when the narrative tried to erase me. Restoration wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the future became mine again, no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what I chose to build now that accuracy had replaced assumption. And that was enough. Restoration didn't erase what the loss had taken with it. It corrected the record, but it couldn't correct time. There were months I would never get back. Moments missed. Trust that had thinned quietly while no one was watching. Even after the outcome changed, the weight of that absence remained. Some relationships never returned to what they were. A few people apologized awkwardly. Most said nothing at all. Silence, once again, was the system's preferred language. I learned to accept that closure doesn't always come with conversation. The cost wasn't only external. I had changed. The person who walked back into that restored position was more careful, more deliberate, less trusting of certainty. I no longer assumed fairness was automatic. I no longer believed good intentions protected anyone from being misunderstood. That awareness came with loss. I missed the ease I used to carry into interactions. The ability to speak freely without measuring consequences. That version of me had been shaped by belief in systems I now understood differently. Still, I didn't resent the change. The experience had sharpened my judgment. It taught me how power moves quietly, how narratives form without permission, and how patience can outperform outrage. Justice had been restored, but innocence had been replaced with awareness. There were nights I thought about what would have happened if I had given up early. If I had accepted the outcome and walked away. The idea unsettled me more than the loss itself. Because the truth wouldn't have disappeared. It would have been buried. That realization carried its own weight. The cost of fighting had been isolation, restraint, and endurance. The cost of not fighting would have been something far worse, erasure. As I moved forward, I carried both the restoration and the cost together. One did not cancel the other. They existed side by side, shaping how I approached everything that followed. Justice had corrected the outcome. But the journey had rewritten me. And while I wished the cost had been lower, I understood something clearly by then. What I paid was not for justice itself. It was for the knowledge of how easily it can be taken, and how carefully it must be protected once you've reclaimed it. That knowledge stayed with me, quiet but permanent, shaping every decision after the truth finally found its place again. The lesson didn't arrive as advice or warning. It revealed itself slowly, through reflection, after the urgency had faded and the outcome had settled. I learned that justice is rarely about truth alone. Truth is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. Systems respond to structure, not emotion. They move when presented with clarity, not outrage. And once a narrative hardens, it resists correction unless confronted with undeniable precision. I learned how easily silence can be misinterpreted. Quiet is often mistaken for weakness, acceptance, or guilt. But silence, when chosen deliberately, can be preparation. It creates space to observe, to document, to understand how power actually operates. I learned that timing matters as much as evidence. Revealing the truth too early can damage it. Waiting, though painful, allows inconsistencies to accumulate until denial becomes impossible. Perhaps the hardest lesson was about people. Most don't intend harm. They align with certainty because it feels safe. They repeat stories because questioning them requires effort and risk. When outcomes change, they rarely reflect on their role. They simply adjust and move on. Understanding that freed me from resentment. I stopped expecting accountability from individuals who had never paused long enough to doubt the original story. Their silence wasn't personal. It was habitual. I also learned something about myself. I was capable of endurance I didn't know I had. I could restrain anger without losing conviction. I could hold truth quietly without needing validation. I could trust myself even when no one else did. That self-trust became the most valuable thing I reclaimed. Justice returned what had been taken, but it also gave me something new, perspective. I no longer measured success by speed or recognition. I measured it by accuracy and sustainability. What happened to me wasn't unique. It happens every day, quietly, inside systems that prioritize efficiency over understanding. The difference was that I stayed present long enough to be counted again. The lesson, in the end, was simple but difficult. Truth survives best when protected by patience. And justice, when it finally arrives, belongs most to those who refuse to disappear while waiting for it. I used to think justice was something granted, a moment when the right person speaks, the right authority listens, and everything returns to balance. I believed it arrived because it was deserved. I know better now. Justice doesn't move on sympathy. It doesn't respond to desperation. It doesn't appear simply because someone was wronged. It moves when truth is positioned where it cannot be ignored, and when patience outlasts resistance. What I went through changed the way I understand fairness forever. Not because the system corrected itself, but because I learned how fragile certainty really is. How easily a life can be redirected by confidence alone. How quickly silence can be mistaken for guilt. I don't tell this story to inspire outrage. Outrage fades quickly. I tell it because quiet endurance rarely gets acknowledged, and yet it's what carries truth through the longest stretches of injustice. There were moments I wanted to disappear. Moments when staying silent felt unbearable. Moments when giving up would have been easier than waiting. But walking away wouldn't have meant peace. It would have meant letting someone else's version of events define the rest of my life. I refused that. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deliberately. I stayed present. I stayed precise. I stayed patient longer than the narrative expected me to. And eventually, that patience shifted the weight of certainty back where it belonged. Justice didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with correction. With files amended. With access restored. With the quiet understanding that accuracy had replaced assumption. That was enough. What I reclaimed wasn't just what had been taken. I reclaimed authorship over my own story. I learned that dignity doesn't require an audience, and resilience doesn't require recognition. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. You don't need to be loud to be right. You don't need to rush to be heard. And you don't need permission to prepare. Sometimes the strongest response to injustice is endurance paired with clarity. Sometimes the most powerful move is waiting while others assume the ending has already been written. It hasn't. Stories can change. Outcomes can shift. Systems can correct themselves, not because they want to, but because truth eventually leaves them no alternative. This wasn't just my second chance at justice. It was my confirmation that truth, when protected long enough, doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it finally moves, it moves forward. Quietly, completely, and without needing approval from anyone who once doubted it.